have a weekend to myself. And what else to do with 48 hours without any obligations other than irresponsibly lose sleep and spending it all on getting an army done for my new favorite game. Asmodee kindly sent me all the new starter boxes for Star Wars Legion, and after painting the Rebel forces and the Imperium, I kinda knew I would like to make the Separatists my main army. Mostly because I like how the droids play, but also because I knew they would be very fun to paint, being mostly machines and all. So in this video I'll spend as much time as I need to finish a playable Star Wars Legion army as quickly as possible, and I'm not gonna stop until it's done. And yes, this is either dedication or the first step towards turning into General Grievous myself, only through caffeine and poor life choices, and not by replacing organs. Now, obviously, to make this a realistic situation, I also had to include the assembly time. And if you saw my first Legion video where I painted the Rebellion and Empire sets, you heard me raving about how quickly they were to assemble. Unfortunately, while I was opening the Separatist box, I quickly realized that this wouldn't be the case with this faction. It looked really easy in the movies, but the mechanical nature of these droids simply makes it kinda impossible to cast them in as little pieces as a stormtrooper or a rebel leader. And since almost everything in this army is a machine, I would be facing bodies with multiple parts and arms and legs with multiple parts, and of course all of that would have to be cleaned. I just can't bring myself to ignore mold lines. The Jedi preach letting go of attachment. I wish it was that easy. And when I thought, boy, the B1s and B2s were taking a while to assemble, and then I ran into the droids and almost wanted to cry. At that point, I started understanding why the Trade Federation just ships them folded. But more on that later. The way the joints on the B2s work made me look up pictures from the movies, and they do look a little different. So I made these pegs a little shorter, which makes the arms sit a little closer to the body, which I liked a bit more. And don't get me wrong, overwhelmingly I still like how the Star Wars Legion minis assemble. They're really well engineered, fit together nicely without even the slightest parts deviation. And if you don't like the suggested pose of these clankers, you can modify the joints with a little snipping or cutting and create some more custom poses. Because nothing says Star Wars like dramatically posing robots that will statistically miss most of their shots anyway. The way units work in this game is that you have a number printed on the corresponding stat card, which indicates how many minis you can have in a single unit. And then these symbols mean you can additionally stuff in a leader and a heavy weapon option. So the total number of minis in my B2 unit would be 5. The B1s are really delicate and finicky, but the good thing is all the mold lines are really thin and they can mostly be cleaned with sandpaper. But there's still a lot of pieces to get through per mini, so it's far from quick, and I have to do this on 8 models.
Roger, roger. Repeat 7 more times.
And so the first few hours flew by. The droids are gorgeous models, but they were quite the step up in complexity from already rather complex base troops. The twin blasters have cables integrating in the back. That was funky to assemble, but again, you got to appreciate the precision, and the result is really worth it. They look absolutely fantastic on the table, but if you look at the clock, you might guess my state of mind at this point. We already spent 5 hours on cleaning and assembly, and I still had to do the final boss, General Grievous. And these instructions look a little daunting. And do you know what else is daunting? Learning new skills. And this is where this video's sponsor, AIRBRUSH, comes in. AIRBRUSH is an art learning platform that provides instruction and guidance for people of all skill levels. I'm a big believer in learning and getting better through actively trying, and this approach is at the core of AIRBRUSH's philosophy. AIRBRUSH's topics range from absolute basics to advanced integrated concepts, all under the guidance of expert illustration professionals. When you choose one of the countless courses they offer, seems like there's one for everything. They'll guide you through the subject with actual exercises, which helps you practice the skills you are learning immediately. Their roadmap approach helps you internalizing the principles, starting from practicing the basic brush strokes through more advanced applications of the subject matter, and every step builds on the knowledge and skill you gained during the steps before. Take folds on clothes, for example. At first I learned how cloth behaves in theory, and then I got to apply these ideas in a few basic drawing exercises that gradually got more complex and incorporated more ideas and new principles. Each topic has multiple roadmaps that build on each other and break complex and multi-layered topics like drawing landscapes down into bite-sized tasks that help you learn all of these ideas from the ground up. Their progress tracking and gamified approach helps you to stay consistent, gain XP for every completed completed lesson and see how far you have already come in your drawing journey through your achievement tracker. Learning new skills is so much easier with guidance, and here's the kicker: you can even get feedback on the platform. Check out the Artward feedback tool, a place where you can upload the works in progress you're struggling with. To receive feedback, simply upload your drawing, write down what you're struggling with, and share the link with your community. I'm happy that Artward gave me the opportunity to offer my viewers a huge discount. Use my link down in the description to grab 30% off of their yearly premium plan. And soon you'll be making amazing art and feel proud and confident in what you have created. And now back to assembling some more clankers. Grievous is another model that's amazing once he's assembled, but some of these choices are bananas, and some of the arms that hold the lightsabers, the hands are literally held up by spheres measuring a fraction of a millimeter, and that's an accident bound to happen. There's not a lot of gaps I really felt like I had to fill, and again, I think this speaks to the quality of the new Legion minis, but whenever there's a gap I wanted to minimize, simply running the brush of my super glue over it like this was enough to make it disappear. And like I said, the droids are fiddly, but everything fits together nicely, and there has been a lot of thought put into how to make them as stable as possible. For example, this peg extension into the small terrain part here through the foot of Grievous makes it rigid, even though it's only making contact with the base in one point. All that was left to do was gluing the minis to the plastic bases. And at this point, I gotta say my motivation was in the gutter. 7 hours in and I hadn't painted a single brush stroke. I know there's people that enjoy the building process, but I really don't. And again, it's not so much the building, it's all that cleaning. But in a way, this was a good exercise to realize that maybe sometimes leaving a mold line where no one can see it is a good trade-off when your sanity is on the line. Ultimately, I decided against complex bases and just put on dirt from my backyard with superglue, and decided I'd try to give it some complexity during the painting phase instead. Yes, authentic terrain sourced from the outer rim, also known as my garden. And I think what kept me from stepping away from the project at this point was the knowledge I could make up for a lot of time during painting, simply because these are mainly robots and I could move quickly. No faces to paint, just soulless armor and hard surfaces. I quickly primed everything black with a rattle can because I knew I wasn't going for flashy colors. And the thing I always enjoyed about Star Wars was the gritty realism. And nothing in Star Wars is factory fresh. Everything looks like it survived a sandstorm, a blaster fight, and at least one hyperspace malfunction. And that was exactly the look I wanted to give my army, and pulling out all the different quick weathering techniques I had at my disposal, and yet working with acrylics only to save precious working time. The way the scheme works is, on top of the cost of the miniatures, you can add orders and equipment that's marked on these cards. And my squad here is supposed to be enough minis for 800 and 1000 points games, which are the standard games for Star Wars Legion. And if you do the math, it doesn't quite add up, but the orders and equipment also have point costs, and that's why. Also, eventually I want to add one of these tanks to my roster so I can switch it into my army list. Which means I will not always pick all of these units, and yes, I will absolutely buy a tank later, because no hobby plan survives first contact with disposable income. So to speed things up, I used my airbrush whenever I could. I'll leave a link to my gallery setup in the description if you want a budget option that still can compete with all the expensive airbrushes. Here I sprayed the B Super Droids and the Droid cars with white aluminium, and I knew I wanted to give the B1s an ochre color, and finally settled on a base coat of green ochre. Nothing says industrial mass production like blasting paint onto robots with high pressure. I blasted them with vampiric flesh from a zenithal direction to give the illusion of light from above, because even soulless droids deserve dramatic cinematic lighting. I didn't worry too much about that on the metallic minis, just leaving the bright aluminium color exposed more on these upper areas during the shading process would create a similar result. And that saved me one step and some much needed time. For the B1 droids, I mixed a shade color from hardened leather, speed paint, and green ochre, and just to make sure this would still behave like a speed paint, and so I could modulate the opacity and intensity a little, I added a bit of speed paint medium too. And I gotta say, ever since I mixed washes from glaze medium and regular acrylics more than 20 years ago, this is still one of my favorite ways to paint. The paint settling in the recesses and shading panels without coffee staining is such a quick way to make miniatures more interesting in just a minute. All you have to do is babysit the pigment a bit, making sure there isn't giant blobs of paint forming that will clog detail, and wiping away excess paint from the higher up areas you want brighter. The best thing about using this for batch painting is that you don't have any downtime. because while you wait for the paint to dry, you can just move on to the next mini. This almost feels like you are painting 8 minis in the same time you would normally take for one, and that feels really good. And while the result looked really great, I suddenly thought about a way to make my army look more like a coherent force. So I went with these red markings on the shoulders, and I would just try to repeat that color as much as possible on the other minis. And since it's good practice to distinguish your commanders within the squad, I painted the leader's shoulders yellow, using white as the base color to make it stand out more. After painting the weapons and the extra gear black, I mixed the dark brown from dark wood and black and picked that up with a dry brush, which I carefully run over the edges to darken them. We did this a couple of times before in other videos, especially on the Grimdark Marines. But while there I used it more like a sledgehammer, here I wanted the effect to be a bit more subtle, and I tried to make it look like some natural weathering. So I tried to be a bit more precise. On the heads I made sure to darken the lower parts a bit more to emphasize the gradients going from a brighter to a darker beige, and once I was happy with the edges, I also ran the brush over larger flat areas like the backpack to create some extra detail like scratch lines and grain. The right amount of paint on the brush is key here, and sometimes the paint will not stick to the very corners of the edges and they end up looking bright in the middle of some dark paint when we want them to be the darkest. So I fixed that by going back in and carefully painting on some extra layers with a regular brush. Now it's debatable doing this step after darkening the edges. Probably would have been smarter to do that before, but I wanted to add a few lighter spots and sponged on a few brighter beige specks, focusing on higher up areas and also to bang up the red a little bit. To create a similar purple red that droids have in the prequel movies, I used the speed paint again. The Goddess Glow was the perfect color for this, and I'm using a brush here to apply the paint, thinning it about 50-50 with speed paint medium. I always start a little more conservative when I use washes, because I can always apply a second layer. But I can't get rid of something that ends up being too opaque with one thick layer. So the first wash was a little too thin, but what it showed me is that a lot of it would collect in these lower regions here. That's okay, and as we're going to see later, made for a cool effect. But now I know better where I have to babysit the wash a bit and where I have to push my pigments, where I have to be careful not to get too much pooling and so on. And as I'm switching to the second model, I'm starting more opaque because of that. I'd say this is almost pure Goddess Glow now, and I can apply this first layer a lot quicker. Then switching back to the first droids, I give the lower areas a more controlled layer, making sure the pigment collects a bit more on these harsher transitions, and I keep doing that 4 or 5 times until I'm happy with the coverage. And this babysitting results in areas where the metallics shine through. In this case, I went for the upper areas to be brighter to keep a zenithal light source, and I deliberately pushed a few more layers into these areas I want shaded. And not only does this give lighter and darker areas, there also is a transition from red into what I'd call a dark purple in these areas covered in extra layers. And yes, I could have applied all of this with an airbrush, which would result in more opaque and even layers instantly. But I'd have to mask off the rest of the model, and I'd still have to work in the variety and shading. And if I can do something by brush, I generally choose the brush to keep my pigment pushing skills sharp. And I simply don't trust my mask skills at 2 AM in the morning. Then I covered the rest of the body in Occultist Cloak, which says blackish blue-gray on the bottle, but I'd say it's a slightly purple-gray, and that would harmonize well with the shading in the red parts. I do find the written indicators of what you can expect the color to look like on the speed paint bottles amazing, by the way. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, since what you can see through the bottle might be deceiving, and the approximation on the cube that's printed on the label isn't always easy to get right. I knew that I wanted the speed paint to do the heavy lifting on the B2s as well, so I quickly went through them one by one, making sure the pigment stayed in the lower areas of all the panels. You can see that very well in the chest and shoulder panels, and whenever I had too much pigment collecting on the raised areas, I wiped that off with a brush dipped in pure speed paint medium. I started from Tyrian Navy, which is a blackish blue, to which I added an extra brush tip of black, which resulted in this blackened armor with a hint of dark turquoise. And depending on how much black paint you add, this can add a really cool scorched metal effect. And once I was happy with the gradients, usually after 1 or 2 controlled layers, I went back to the white aluminium and sponged on some texture. I focused on the higher up areas, making them brighter, and everywhere else I tried to only hit the exposed areas, making it look like there was some mechanical chipping going on the edges, and at the same time this would keep all the elements nicely separated by leaving the recesses dark. And if they don't look like they've been dragged through geonosis, I'm not finished. In a similar way, I wanted to chip the red on the droid cars, and here I focused on the parts that would hit the ground a lot once they are in their rolling form, so the front parts of most of the panels, for example. And this creates some realism and credibility, but also a nice contrast and definition without having to do edge highlighting. Right after that, I took my dry brush and dipped it into the metallic paint, but got rid of just enough paint so it would only leave very light strokes. Then I dragged it along the outer shell in the direction the droids would roll. On the blasters and additional equipment the B1 droids were using, I put down a blue-gray highlight layer and then put some chipping on the edges. At first dabbing on the tip of the brush to create larger chips, and then I let the paint dry on the brush a little and just rubbed some of that paint off on the gear to create smaller flaking. Then I quickly masked off everything but a vertical line on the chest of my B2 leader to make him stand out a bit. And I used the same red I placed on the shoulders of the B1s to mark him as the squad leader. And then after putting down a dot of white on these little lights they have on the front, I gave this a layer of orange fluor paint and the last layer of red fluor paint, covering the recesses more than the raised parts. So it looked like the brighter center would project red light outwards. Nothing says advanced war machine like a tiny glowing standby LED. If any of this tickles your fancy and you want to grab any of the starter boxes, maybe to play the game and get started at a discount, or just to pick up a few excellent Star Wars themed miniatures just to paint them, I'll leave a few links to where you can find all of them in the description of this video. So after 5.5 hours more, I had most of my force finished. I just needed to work on obviously the most complex of them all. I'm not sure what the better strategy is, leaving the mini that would take the most effort for last after already spending half a day painting, or if it's better to do it first. But honestly at this point I thought I would just go to bed if I was ever going to lose my nerves and get back to it with a fresh mind in the morning. But spoiler alert, I powered through this guy because sleep is temporary and hobby progress is eternal. And most of all, while I started to work on him, everything was a lot more straightforward than I initially thought. And after applying the main colors of the cloak, I gave all the parts that I wanted to end up dark and didn't belong to the armor panels a coat of white aluminium. Then I gave the panels a coat of green-gray, so everything was ready for the shading part at the same time. I give the metallic some depth with the same mix I used for my dark B2s, and I think it works really well because Grievous is often shown as having a very dark droid body, and it's not always clear whether it's metal or just some other dark material or paint job, so this was a good compromise. The rest of Grievous's body is made from this bone-like material that looks really creepy in the close-ups, and I tried to go for a similar hue by mixing a wash from cork brown and speed paint medium. I gave the lightsabers a coat of white and then just slapped on a layer of fluorescent paint. And this effect has a great impact, especially considering how little time it takes. And if I ever want to touch this up and make it more sophisticated, it's a great base to come back to and rework it. I gave the bone armor a layer of highlights with ivory, adding some scratches and dots here and there, besides the main highlights on the head and the chest. And then I used the dry brush again to create darkening on the edges, just like I did with the B1 droids. And this just works really good on bright armor panels and it ties the army together a bit more. When I gave the cloak some highlights, I first blocked in larger areas, leaving some darker shadows in the areas opposite to my light source, and then as I went brighter, I did add some stipple texture. And when I was done with that, I went back in and created some additional shading and transitions by airbrushing in some Goddess Glow, which ties together the gradients a little, makes the mini look more coherent, and adds some color variety. I also airbrushed in some global highlights on the front of the cloak, and then gave it some final blue edge highlights in the back. For the bases I picked out a medium brown and painted all the earth I applied with it. And while it was still wet, I dumped some REFERAL on and let it do whatever it wanted. This created some cool variety in the base color and provided some shading in the recesses. As a last step, I dumped on a lot of light soil liquid pigment and used white spirit to spread that out. And here's the result. Fully playable Separatist force finished in one very questionable weekend life decision. And honestly, I'm really happy with how they turned out. On the table, they look cohesive, gritty, and unmistakably Star Wars. The focus on shading helps with readability, the weathering ties everything together, and most importantly, I now actually have a solid army core ready to deploy, instead of another box sitting on my pile of shame. This challenge reminded me of a few things. First, assembly time is real time that you can't shortcut or hack your way out of. And I'm sure everyone doing challenges like these pays someone to assemble the minis. A second, perfection is the enemy of finished. Leaving the occasional invisible mold line might be healthier than losing your sanity at hour 6. And third, speed painting can still be creative painting. Limiting yourself forces decisions, and those decisions often lead to techniques and shortcuts you'll reuse later. Did I question my life choices at multiple points? Yes. Would I do it again? Probably, because at the end of the day, this hobby isn't just about pristine display pieces, it's about having armies you're excited to put on the table, roll dice with, and make pew-pew noises at when nobody's around. And isn't that all that matters? And thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and I'll see you in the next one.